Hello everyone and welcome. It's 3:30 in the afternoon in the UK at the moment. We're still waiting for a few more participants to join us. So please sit tight and we'll begin in a couple of minutes. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Now, before we get started, I would ask that first and foremost, we absorb the housekeeping points on the screen and note that the full webinar, including the Q&A section, is being recorded. So if you want to ask a question, please pose it in writing. As I can see, I think one of our attendees already has done in the Q&A box, and do please include your name and organizational affiliation. And in true democratic style, if you want to boost the importance of a question that has already been posed, do please make use of the upvote function, which allows you to increase its precedence. So most of you will be familiar with RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, but for those of you who are not, we are a specialist research programme within RUSI on the intersection between illicit finance and security, a topic which of course is extremely pertinent to what we're going to be discussing here today with the UK's integrated review. Now, through our work, we strive towards a world where confronting financial crime is recognised as a collective responsibility, both in the public and private sectors. And we contribute through our analysis and promotion of viable solutions. And we aim for our research to equip the international community, again, both public-private sector, with the knowledge and tools to understand, identify and disrupt the threats of illicit finance. And of course, we seek to bring together the right kinds of experience and research talent to consider the challenges posed by illicit finance and range and issues alongside it, and their intersection with security. And I think we'll all agree we've got an excellent panel to discuss these issues here today. So now we've got the housekeeping out of the way. Welcome everybody to today's event. I'd first like to introduce myself. My name is Matthew Redhead, and I am an Associate Fellow at the CFCS, where I've been working for the last couple of years with the team on issues around anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist finance. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to introduce and chair today's webinar. So, as you're all aware, as it says on the holding slide, the topic of today's discussion is the UK government's recently published integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, which to its friends is known as the integrated review, and I will refer to it as such from here on in. Now, as has been obvious in the media since the review was published later in March, there's been considerable interest in what might be deemed the more traditional or conventional national security aspects of the document, including issues around the rise of China, the need for a tilt towards the Indo-Pacific, and also discussions around the UK's military capabilities and the balance between manpower in the UK armed forces and the scale of the country's nuclear arsenal. So in many ways, we've touched upon many of the conventional aspects of that in the media coverage. But despite the media headlines, and in many ways, this particular review is unusual and in some ways different from the kinds of reviews we've seen before every 5 years emanating from the UK government on defence and security. What this particular report does, this review does, is take the themes that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 defence reviews, looking at broader thematic issues and weaving them into broader concerns about national security along the lines of the ongoing state-driven threats that we face from China, Russia, and elsewhere. So it's very interesting as well to say that we are now having the concepts of illicit finance, sanctions, economic crime, and serious organised crime more readily integrated into our discussion of national strategy. And one of the things that, well, as many of our panelists have already pointed out in print, really stands out is the prominence and the recognition that these topics get and have not been provided before. Not only does the review look at the issue of the scale of some of these issues, particularly around economic crime, and see it as a volume issue, but also looks at the potential linkage between these issues and the intentional activities of bad actors from states, terrorist networks, and serious organised crime. And the review on several occasions, quite interestingly, refers to the types of threats that we're facing in these areas as potential proxy weapons that can be used against the UK well below what is described as a formal threshold of war. So it's a very different point of view on UK national security. So there are many fine words within this document on the need to focus on illicit finance, economic statecraft, organised crime and economic crime. And many of the panelists have expressed their welcoming for that. I think one of them described the green shoots in this review, focusing on this particular area. But there is a real issue, as another panelist said, about how serious this review is. The use of words in a document is one thing. How will that translate through into actual actions? Can we expect the Boris Johnson administration to follow through with real vigour on these commitments? And what real difference can we in the UK make on these matters with our own particular contribution? Now, before we move to the panel, I'd just like to say that if you're interested in these issues, then do please take a look at the RUSI website, where these issues are covered in much more depth, and you'll have an opportunity to see some of the contributions which I've just referenced from panelists on particular aspects of the review. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel to discuss these issues today. And I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Keating, who is the Director of CFCS at RUSI and a long-time proponent of a more integrated UK approach to security and illicit finance. We're also joined by Emile Dahl, Senior Research Fellow at CFCS and the team's Sanctions expert. Helena Wood, Associate Fellow at CFCS, is also joining us today, and she's done a considerable amount of recent work on the threat from economic crime and the UK response. And also, very pleased to say today we have a colleague in from the Serious Organised Crime and Policing Research Group at RUSI, Keith Ditcham, who's worked extensively on serious and organised crime issues at practitioner and strategic levels. So we have an excellent panel here today. And as ever, we welcome your thoughts, comments and questions as participants in today's webinar. So do please make good use of the Q&A box and its upvote function. And I will do my best to cover as many of those questions as we possibly can when we get to the discussion. So with all that said, I will now pass the floor over to Tom Keating. Tom.
Great. Matthew, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. So I think what I will dive into the kind of international illicit finance element of the integrated review, and others will cover their areas of expertise. And as you mentioned, obviously, the focus of most commentators on the UK government's review was on the headline issues, and we don't need to touch on those. I think we at RUSI and others that follow illicit finance in the UK were somewhat resigned to the issue being absent from the IR, as it had not really been obvious that the Johnson government had grasped the foreign and security policy dimension of illicit finance, despite the UK's age-old problem of being a facilitator of global illicit finance. So why did we think that? Why did we have such a kind of negative view? Well, when challenged on the topic, ministers and others representing the government in recent times have struggled for a response that has moved much beyond referring to the Financial Action Task Force's assessment that the UK holds the top spot in the fight against dirty money. And anybody who knows me will know that that's one of my pet hates. Or pointing to the newly introduced post-Brexit sanctions regime. None of this kind of suggests a real engagement with the issue of international illicit finance facilitated by the UK. It is, I think, important, though, to recognise that steps have been taken to bolster the UK's criminal justice response to illicit finance, but little appears to have been done to assess and address the strategic challenges it poses, including considering the implications of actually neglecting the issue. But as it turned out, I certainly felt I had to eat my words. We were actually pleasantly surprised by the way in which the IR treats illicit finance. And importantly, I think we also think that allies, particularly the United States, that have been calling on the UK to leverage its central role in international finance to contribute to a greater extent in this field, should see some positive signals to build on. But let's look at the disappointments, I suppose, or the inevitable criticisms that surfaced from the commentariat when the IR was published before we look at the pleasant surprises. So firstly, it is absolutely the case that the UK still lacks a proper publicly articulated strategy for addressing the central role it plays in global illicit finance, and the IR clearly doesn't provide any insight into that. More investment, better use of technology, far greater enforcement action is also needed to turn the tide on illicit finance in the UK and as facilitated by the UK, and that clearly remains an outstanding and unanswered problem. Thirdly, a number of the illicit finance responses in the document are rehearsals of current or overdue projects. So the delivery of the economic crime plan is obviously ongoing. The reform of Companies House is still pending. And other issues in the IR related to illicit finance are kind of worryingly prefaced with the alarming statement of as soon as parliamentary time allows, which feels like a bit of a get out. So that's a problem. And finally, frankly, the Johnson government has been woefully uninterested in engaging with the wider implications of the UK's illicit finance issues. And that remains the case, I think, despite the IR. It was notable that when Boris Johnson spoke about the IR in Parliament, he dodged any questions about dirty money and made no reference to illicit finance. So I think many were resigned to there being no mention at all. So therefore, what were the pleasant surprises from our perspective? Well, firstly, and critically, the IR acknowledges that whatever the UK may or perhaps may not have been doing on illicit finance in the past, recent efforts have been below par. And so the government does very explicitly say it needs to reinvigorate its effort. Secondly, and you mentioned this, Matthew, in your opening, I think that recognizing that illicit finance is a potential tool of state and non-state actor interference against the UK and an issue that contributes to global instability and conflict, I think is a really important point and brings the issue of illicit finance kind of into the security domain, into the foreign policy domain. So I think that is to be welcomed. The importance of the topic in Washington is clearly being noticed. Joe Biden obviously has made his views clear on this issue. Key members of his administration have reinforced this priority in recent weeks. So it's welcome that the IR notes the need to bolster cooperation on mutual areas of interest, such as tackling illicit finance, as a priority in the future relationship with the US. And also, and I thought this was interesting, recognizing that partnerships with other major financial markets are needed in order to maximize impact of response against illicit finance. Fourthly, there is recognition that the damage caused to the UK's economy and its reputation by illicit finance issues. The IR says very particularly, economic crime and illicit finance undermine good governance and faith in our economy and tarnish our global reputation by allowing corrupt assets to be held in the UK. And that's a very strong statement of the obvious, but nonetheless, it's important to recognize that. And then lastly, the expansion of the UK's new ability to impose financial sanctions to hold state and non-state actors accountable is underlined. Emil will talk about this. That's good to see, but from my perspective, I think the centrality of sanctions to the government response to illicit finance remains concerning. My view, sanctions are issued when things have gone wrong. It would be nice for the illicit finance issues to be dealt with upstream rather than after the fact. But let's not get carried away. At the end of all of this, there are glaring gaps remaining, and that is in particular acknowledging the extent to which the UK is central to the problem of international illicit finance. The dramatic cuts in budgets of those departments that have previously led international illicit finance engagement for the UK, the lack of a properly financed domestic response, these all do little to suggest that the government has its heart in the matter. As I mentioned already, the Prime Minister's comments or lack of comments in the Commons on illicit finance when questioned was disappointing. So I think to conclude and to echo something that you said, Matthew, the IR itself recognises what global Britain means in practice is best defined by actions rather than words. And of course, so far, we've only had words, and the world awaits those, but I think we would argue, overdue actions. But I see the glass perhaps being half full. Reinvigoration, we hope, will lead to action. But of course, we look forward to having those actions proved to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. And sort of an interesting, balanced view there. I'll be interested to hear what our other panelists have to say. I think there are half full and half empty views on the panel today, so it'll be interesting to get a bit of a debate going on that later. But before we do that, we'll move over to issues of economic statecraft, which get plenty of mention within the integrated review. And for that, I'd like to welcome Emil, who's going to give us his particular view and his perspective on the IR.
Thank you, Matthew. And yeah, Tom mentioned already that sanctions is mentioned quite a lot in the integrated review. And I want to just quickly recap for everyone on the call who might not know, or I'm sure most of us know, but how do we get to this point where we're now talking about Britain's new sanctions? We've heard about sanctions being deployed for decades, but as a part of leaving the European Union, the UK had to establish its own sanctions regime. So we are no longer implementing sanctions as part of the EU. Those sanctions in the EU crucially have to be agreed by all then 28 member states. Now the UK can do its own, and the integrated review talks about the deployment of this new sanctions power that is up to the UK alone. So I just want to start there because I think it's important to remember that sanctions is not a new phenomenon for the UK. And I think the integrated review sometimes talks about sanctions being this brand new policy tool. The concept of sanctions in the UK has been going on for decades. We've been implementing sanctions. We've been responding to state threats with sanctions for a while now. It is just in a new way, the decision-making process for sanctions is what's changed. And that offers us more agility in how we want to do stuff. And I also want to just emphasize that sanctions is not a policy in itself. As Tom alluded to, sanctions is a tool that you use to promote or achieve certain policy outcomes, and it often operates alongside other policy instruments. And I think the integrated review talks a little bit about that, but it's interesting to see how sometimes there's a conflation, not in this integrated review, but in general, around sanctions being a policy or sanctions being a tool. So having said that up front, there are four main areas in the integrated review where sanctions are mentioned as a possible tool to respond or to address or to protect those areas. The first one is around human rights. So we have a frequent mention about the UK's new human rights sanctions regime. And there's also the statement, the reminder that the UK was the first European country to announce sanctions against Belarus in September 2020 under this new human rights sanctions regime. Of course, the UK is not the first to have such a human rights sanctions regime. We've been largely following the US and Canada on this, and the Belarus sanctions were in fact done in coordination and in unison with Canada. And the deployment of these human rights sanctions is not unique to the UK. It is part of a general trend in Western governments to use these more value-based thematic sanctions to protect human rights and democratic values abroad. And the EU, since the UK left the European Union, the EU now also has such a human rights sanctions regime. The second area is the introduction in 2021 of new sanctions to address corruption and prevent those who are involved in corruption from freely entering the UK or channeling their money through the UK's financial system. And just a quick point here, which has since come to light, we have statements coming out of the UK Treasury alongside the integrated review talking about how sanctions should be more integrated with wider economic crime tools or existing economic crime tools. And I think that is particularly relevant when it comes to corruption, because corruption has its own tools already established in law enforcement. And I'm sure that Helena and Keith will talk about this. So how this will play out, the introduction of a corruption sanctions regime and how that will operate alongside existing corruption tools, I think is going to be really interesting. But again, the integrated review talks about working with allies who have similar regimes, and it specifically mentions the US and Canada. And perhaps I will just quickly pause there before I do my final two areas where sanctions have been talked about in the integrated review, because there is this explicit mention of the US and Canada. And the UK has worked with both the US and Canada throughout the Brexit transition period. So in the period between leaving the European Union and the future sort of being completely out of the European Union, that 1 year period, the UK worked with the US and Canada on these value-based human rights sanctions and deployed them several times in close coordination with those two. There is no mention here about the EU. And I think that's noteworthy. There's talk about getting multilateral buy-in for sanctions, but the only kind of clear partners that are identified is the US and Canada. And the UK has been frustrated at times with the EU's slow speed on sanctions, but it's quite striking how there is not an explicit mention here of the EU, which now also has a human rights sanctions regime. So just finally, the last two areas where sanctions is highlighted in the integrated review. So area number 3 is around counter-proliferation. So the UK has always had an interest in countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And it here points out that the UK will remain the most engaged non-regional partner on North Korea's denuclearization and on sanctions enforcement. And note here that we're not talking about design of new sanctions, we're talking about enforcement of existing sanctions, which is often a role that's been taken on by the United States. So it'll be interesting to see what the UK will start doing. Will the UK, for example, start sanctioning those who assist North Korea with evasion? Will the UK assist with deploying intelligence capabilities to detect and disrupt sanctions evasion networks in similar fashion as the US is doing? I think that will be interesting and contributing to kind of sanctions enforcement capacity efforts around the world. And then the final area is around responding to state threats. The integrated review talks about using sanctions as part of an approach to promote our values and combat state threats, terrorism, cyber attacks. And it again notes that the departure from the EU means that we can move more quickly through multilateral channels to do so. But I just want to point out here again, responding to state threats, responding to terrorism with sanctions is not something that wasn't part of the EU's mandate on sanctions. Again, I think we forgot a little bit about just what the EU could do on sanctions, even if we were frustrated with the slow speed sometimes. And I will highlight Iran as a brilliant example here. The EU sanctions on Iran have often been credited for bringing Iran to the negotiating table and getting to the nuclear nuclear agreement with Iran in 2015. So again, the lack of recognition here around the EU and the sanctions that we've successfully completed with the EU in the past, I think is quite striking. And then on top of that, we have the lack of any future agreement with the EU on sanctions. So in the future relationship agreement, sanctions was not part of it, despite both the UK and the EU saying in its negotiating mandate that there was a need for, or it was in both parties' interest to agree a framework for coordinating on sanctions. So I want to just finish on that, because I think while it is an ambitious outlining of how the UK will use its new sanctions regime, and it is now a wholly British foreign policy tool that can be deployed for British interests, I think it's worth emphasizing that its use and its success will depend on how well it's coordinated with others, and the EU will play a key part here. And while talking a lot about how the departure from the EU offers the UK opportunities on sanctions, I also think we should talk about how the departure from the EU offers some challenges on sanctions without the EU on board. So I will finish there, but look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Emil. And I think there's sort of a very interesting point that you made. When we talk about an integrated review, it's very easy to take an inward-looking view about what we mean by integrated rather than a more outward-looking review, which brings me to Helena, because one of the things that Helena picked up on in some of her commentary, which I thought was really interesting before this session, were the issues about making sure that we're using all the players on the pitch, which I think is very much along the same lines in a domestic sense of what you were saying on an international perspective there, Emil. So thank you, Emil. And I'll hand over now to Helena.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks to my predecessor for their comments there. So yes, as we've said, as my co-conspirators in the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies very much look outwards into the world, but I very much look back inwards to the UK, and my research focuses on the UK's economic crime domestic response. So what's the headline from me on where I think the integrated review takes that UK economic crime domestic response? If I may, I'll continue the kind of football analogy that Matthew's picked up on there from my commentary, which you can find online at rusi.org. And if we see economic crime as a football team, you know, very much a few years ago, it was very much down in the second division, very much beleaguered, struggling away. But we saw it in kind of the Whitehall Stakes move up to more of a kind of Champions League status in 2019, when we saw the economic crime plan published, and it really made it a much more cross-Whitehall agenda. So where do I think the integrated review takes us? Well, I really think it takes the domestic economic crime response closer to the Whitehall Premier League, really. But it's not quite there, and it's very much in the playoff territory. So if I may, I'll kind of set out why I think that's the case, looking at some of the kind of broader emphasis, shift in emphasis in this document around the domestic agenda, and then secondly, some of the specifics around economic crime itself and how that is played out in the document, looking at the kind of more domestic sense in which that's dealt with. So if we're looking at the kind of broad shift in tone, I'll start with a quote from the integrated review, if I may. And the quote that really stood out for me was, "Our foreign policy rests on strong domestic foundations." You know, that might seem quite throwaway to quite a few people on this call, or it might seem a bit more indicative of this wider sort of flag waving tone from the top that we're seeing from this particular government, and some might see it as just a self-evident fact. However, as an ex-NCA officer and someone who's been knocking around the national security space for quite some time, I remember when the National Security Council was established just over a decade ago now, and how that operated in its infancy. And to misquote the then Home Secretary Theresa May, it was very much an Oxbridge foreign policy debating club. All those criminological issues that we think are very, very important absolutely did not get a look in at that time. It was absolutely inconceivable that you would have the National Security Council discussing proceeds of crime, money laundering, fraud, and even serious organised crime, which my colleague Keith will touch on next, very much didn't even get a look in. It was relegated to a subcommittee of the NSC. And so very much, we're seeing a very different tone to the general foreign policy stance, which really links it back to the domestic agenda. So that gives me some sort of cautious hope that national security policy and foreign policy will now recognise the need to get our own house in order across a range of fronts, but including in the space of proceeds of crime, illicit finance, money laundering and fraud. But it's also for me, a signal that we are now starting to see a tone in foreign policy and national security policy, which isn't just about tacking in the geopolitical winds here. It's much more about a foreign policy that delivers for the UK electorate. An electorate that is increasingly starting to care about things like proceeds and crime and economic crime issues, particularly fraud, which is an issue I'll touch upon. So yeah, aside from that broad shift, there were other reasons why I saw some green shoots of hope, that crocus of hope that we've been talking about for a while. So some of the specifics that gave me that cautious optimism in the document, well, it goes back to seeing this document in the context of a continuum of national security policy. So if you look back to the Strategic Defence and Security Review, economic crime was barely in there. It was a kind of throwaway subset of a broader threat around serious organised crime or terrorism. It was very much not seen as an issue and a threat in its own right. I think personally the integrated review changes that. It very much recognises, as Tom touches on, that this is a threat to our own national security. It's not just a criminal justice issue. So I think that's quite a significant shift for me. But what does it look like in detail? What were the things that made me smile in a time where it's been very difficult to find reasons to be cheerful? Well, the first of these, the most surprising and yet unsurprising issue which features there, is around fraud. Surprising because, having fraud mentioned as a national security and foreign policy priority was absolutely pie in the sky 10 years ago, or even, to be honest, 6 months ago. Yet now we're seeing fraud peppered throughout as an issue which really matters for the UK at a global level and to its own national security. But it's also quite unsurprising at the same turn for the Whitehall watchers amongst us who've seen fraud steadily rise up that political agenda over the past sort of 18 months, in recognition that it's quite an out of control threat. It's had a changing victim profile, for example, issues we point to in our recent paper, The Silent Threat, which I'd encourage you to read, and it's free to view on rusi.org. But around fraud, sticking with fraud for a while, what do they plan to do about this? What's the most significant thing in there for me? Well, for me, it was the mention of the Cyber Defence Force. And this is a new MOD GCHQ SIS body, which will look at the kind of broad-ranging cyber threat, but within that will also tackle fraud as a subset of that broader cyber threat. Now, if you'd told me 10 years ago that you would have GCHQ and SIS looking at fraud as an issue that mattered to them, I really would have fallen off my chair. So I think it's yet to see. Again, proof will be in the pudding. What will they actually do against that threat? But the fact that it's very much been put on their table for me is an opportunity. Second, Tom's mentioned the UK Economic Crime Plan, which is basically the basis of the UK's domestic front against the broad-ranging economic crime threat it faces. And for me, it was really interesting to see that mentioned in the context of the UK's aspiration to be this kind of open, resilient global economy. And it was very much seeing the economic crime plan as a sort of bulwark against the threats that such an economy poses. We all know that with an open economy, bad money flows equally with the good. And it was really interesting for me to see the economic crime plan seen as a sort of aspect of our economic security, and this broader recognition that if we are to protect our economic security, we absolutely have to protect it against economic crime. And given that economic security, I think, is going to be a much bigger and broader theme in our national security policy over the next decade, that certainly offers an opportunity to kind of elevate economic crime as a policy issue and a priority across Whitehall. And finally, I'll touch on it very briefly because Tom's already mentioned it. It's the recognition that the UK's reputation as a haven for the proceeds of corruption. Probably if you're sitting and watching this from the southeast of England, you know, property probably not far from where you're sitting, the stain this represents the UK's reputation and how that undermines anything we will try and do a global level on illicit finance is, you know, it's better late than never. Sure, it's too late, but, you know, this mea culpa in such a prominent document is certainly a useful signal of intention, though what that means in practice, again, is yet to be seen. So that all sounds very optimistic. I can't be too optimistic. It's not our job to pat the government on the back, so I absolutely won't. You know, it's very, very light on new initiatives. It is, as Tom says, it kind of states things that were already in train. For me, what's really missing is a real statement of intent around the future role for the diplomatic and intelligence community, particularly in supporting the kind of domestic economic crime agenda. So yeah, very, very much in the playoffs still, but nevertheless there's an opportunity for, you know, those people within the Whitehall machinery who focus on economic crime to kick this up to the Premier League. The Economic Crime Plan has 1 year left to run. We're hoping there will be an Economic Crime Plan 2. So the fact of its mention in this very broad-ranging document, if it's grasped well by those policymakers, means they can hopefully grab a greater share of the intelligence and diplomatic community's time in a second iteration of the Economic Crime Plan. So yeah, before I risk going into extra time and getting a penalty, Matthew, I'll stop there and hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. And I'm delighted that you didn't mention the European Super League at all. And obviously, we're hoping that the integrated review isn't going to be like that. Okay, I mean, lots of really interesting points there. And I think one of the things that sort of continues to strike me about this is how thematic a lot of what the integrated reviews, we talk about economic crime, we talk about illicit finance, but there are threats behind that. We've talked about state threat, but there's also serious and organised crime. So I'll now hand over to our colleague from the Serious and Organised Crime Programme at RUSI, Keith Ditcham, to provide his remarks.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm conscious of the fact that we want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, so I'll try and make my comments succinct and to the point. We've already mentioned that this document goes a little bit further than some of its predecessors. I was looking back at the Strategic Defence and Strategic Review document of 2015, and that had as its central aim on the organised crime front to reduce substantially the level of serious organised crime affecting the UK and our interests. That was 2 pages of a document of over 100 pages. So 2% at maximum of that document was devoted to talking about serious organised crime and the protection of the UK and its interests. We know that serious organised crime is increasing in its complexity and its scale. I'm not going to get into debates around its cost and the size of it because it's so difficult to assess. But since the SDSR of 2015, we have seen an explosion in organised crime, and there's no reason to think that that is going to diminish. So, and organised crime has been described as the deadliest national security threat faced by the UK. It impacts on citizens, it impacts on our communities, on our public services, on our businesses, institutions, national reputation, and our infrastructure, as some of the other panelists have already mentioned. So from my perspective, I really welcome the investment in economic crime as highlighted by Helena. But for me, I'm also slightly disappointed that we still think of things such as money laundering as a separate entity to dealing with serious organised crime. It frustrates me immensely that this is not a central plank of the response to organised crime. It is in most cases, the driver for organised crime, the ability to gain money. So with the exception of certain sexual offences, financial gain is the big driver, and yet we still talk about this as some kind of separate entity. The document doesn't really go into other enablers of crime, such as corruption, again, as mentioned by Helena. So there's some slight lack of detail, shall we say, there. I noticed with interest, because it fits my own particular interests at this moment as well, that there's a doubling of investment in county lines and drug supply investment. I spend a large chunk of my career working internationally as what was called a drug liaison officer, and more latterly an international liaison officer. And I welcome that extra money. But I remember in February of last year at the National Police Chiefs Council Conference, Andy Cook, who has just recently retired as the Chief Constable of Merseyside, announcing that drugs are back on the agenda. The question for me is, why were they ever off the agenda? And whilst I accept that other crimes such as human trafficking, modern slavery, firearms trafficking, to name but a few, are important, drugs remains at the centre of organised criminality, and it still remains a major financer for other types of activity, including terrorism. So welcome the doubling of the investment, but I'm not entirely sure what that means, and the document doesn't go into a huge amount of detail on that front. It does promise extra money for child sexual exploitation, and that's a very important issue. But child criminal exploitation, that's the children, the vulnerable children and adults, for that matter, actually, that are being exploited through such things as county lines. Described really as the next grooming scandal, the next Rochdale by a number of academics, is barely touched upon. So again, more detail is required. The strengthening of the National Crime Agency, both Hella and I have worked for the National Crime Agency and welcome that. The document talks about the needing to develop the ability to develop critical data, intelligence and investigation, but it doesn't really promise any extra money, rather a commitment to continue to fund at existing level and to meet extant commitments. So it's difficult to think how that might actually happen when we see organised crime continue to develop and evolve, and those threats becoming more numerous, but also more transnational in their nature as well. An extra 300 officers out of the promised 20,000 officers that are going to be in place by 2023, dedicated to dealing with serious organised crime. Well, that's excellent. That's good news, but I suspect that 300 will be easily subsumed into the regional organised crime units, into the NCA, and the net effect of that may not be as large as that indicate. And the extra money for the criminal justice system as well. Let's not forget that that's really important. But the criminal justice system is really struggling at the moment, and struggling particularly, and it was beforehand, but because of COVID, the backlog in terms of court cases means that justice is not being dispensed in a timely manner. I was talking to someone from the Crown Prosecution Service the other day who told me that referrals through the National Referral Mechanism for Human Trafficking, the NRM, are taking up to 2 years. Well, that is just too long a period of time for someone to remain potentially in a vulnerable position, and taking that back again to earlier comments I made around county lines and drug trafficking and vulnerable populations, as well as other forms of human trafficking, means that that's an inordinate amount of time to wait for a decision as to whether someone is going to be treated as a victim or an offender in our system. The international elements of the document interest me, and there's a lot of talk there about the work through multilateral bodies such as Interpol and Europol. Well, obviously that's Interpol not been affected, but Europol and our status within Europol affected by Brexit. but also through the bilateral liaison network as well. Now, over the years, I've seen that drastically reduce, particularly in countries like Latin America, and very difficult to defend that decision when the UK is a #1 country in Europe for a number of crime types, in particular drugs, and a huge market for cocaine in particular. So that international network has been depleted and it needs to be built up. I'm a big fan of the so-called upstream disruption. I do believe it works, but it needs to make sure that that work is focused on tackling threats that face Europe / the UK and not threats that face our American partners. There's finally as well on that front an ambition to make the UK borders more effective, and in fact talks about by 2025 having the most effective border globally. It does identify at least 270 recognised crossing points for organised crime groups to exploit, and we know that the organised crime groups adapt their modus operandi quicker than law enforcement can respond. Partly they're not bound by the same rules and regulations. So interesting to see how that develops, and again, slight lack of detail, but that's an interesting point to make. But the UK is an island, and one would like to think out of any country that I can think of, it should be relatively easy to protect an island than a country that shares a land border with a number of other countries. So it'd be interesting to see whether that ambition is actually made. So to end on perhaps a slightly more positive note, then what I do like about this document is it is littered with references to serious organised crime. I think I counted 39 references either to the word SOC, serious organised crime, or even just crime, and that's a vast improvement on previous iterations of similar type documents. It talks about it in a holistic manner, and it tries to adopt a holistic approach to and a less siloed approach and a more nuanced approach to tackling organised crime and a number of other issues as well. And I wish it were with that, but I keep coming back to the point. The detail is slightly missing, and I, for one, certainly don't underestimate the scale of that challenge. I hand you back. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Keith. And I think many of the comments that you made there and have been made by others, I think should help form the first question. And the top of the list actually reflects something that I've been thinking about. For my sins, I have worked as a British civil servant in the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office, and I've been involved in drafting fine documents such as this and doing reviews and what have you. And I'm familiar with the wordsmithing that goes on to make sure that the right phrases are used in the right places. The key question then is, and this is our top question on the Q&A as well, as what convinces any of the panelists that this is going to be action and not just words? And as the question also said, there's been a lot of talk about this, even if it hasn't been a lot of talk about putting emphasis on all these different areas, even if it hasn't been in the integrated review, but nothing has really changed. What is it about this, apart from the words, that gives any of us confidence that things are going to change? And to be kind to you, Keith, I won't ask you first because you've just been talking. I think I will throw it back to Helena.
Thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate that. First for me, it's difficult to say whether this is just words or actions, but what is absolutely for sure is we're going to have the most vicious spending review that we have seen in a generation. So it gives me hope that at least those people who are going into battle for very, very meagre resources have a decent armoury in their hands. It's going to be a really, really brutal time to try and get something out of that dwindling central government pot, particularly because a lot of it was defrauded during the COVID business loan fraud scandal, which will no doubt unfurl before our eyes. So the only thing that gives me hope is that it arms policymakers with a greater tool than they've hitherto had to go into that particular battle.
Thank you. I can see, I got a sense that Tom probably wants to throw something in there as well.
Yeah, so I guess what infuriates me enormously is that there are a great number of tools on the table already. There are a great number of civil servants who are working away to try and move forward what the UK does on, particularly on international illicit finance, but domestic side as well. And to sort of use the kind of words that the Prime Minister would use, they need to be unleashed. There's no shortage of, as I say, of ideas and legal tools that we can use. Yet when you look at what's happening to funding, you cannot but wonder whether indeed, as Nick puts in the Q&A, we're just talking about words again. And it's really, I think, depressing when good ideas that have been pushed forward, good ideas that are on the statute book, good ideas that are waiting in the wings to be brought on the statute book aren't just pushed through. I mean, it beggars belief that things like the Register of Overseas Entities Bill, it might come forward should parliamentary time allow. That bill would be phenomenally powerful in sending a message. The UK sent a really fantastic message with its transparent companies register originally. Now is time to send another fantastic message, and Robo would certainly be in there. So that, I'm on the one hand, yes, I feel positive about the review, but it could become a debacle very quickly if we don't see action in some key areas.
Okay, well, a sort of a slightly Shakespearean warning there from Tom about that. Slightly different change. I'll bring Keith in here because I want to come to Emil about the sanctions aspect of this at the end. So, Keith, I mean, what's your take? I mean, I think we got a sense that you two are holding your breath a little bit with this.
Yes, most definitely. I mean, I didn't expect a document such as this to go into huge amount of detail. We have to be realistic as to what place this document occupies in the landscape in the first place. But I think what is key is that what follows needs to follow quickly, and the detail and the consultation in relation to that. I think one of the problems that always comes to the fore is that there are no quick and easy answers. If there was a rock that we could pick up and all the answers have been under that rock, we would have found that rock by now. And what responses normally require is, and I used the word earlier and I'll use it again, is an holistic approach, a multi-agency or partnership response to dealing with issues. And that always creates an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity being, yes, you can bring all the best of those agencies together to work in a collective manner against a common theme. But that requires coordination. That requires the agencies to have a similar understanding of what the problem is and any difficulties, any issues that hidebound those agencies and organisations, their ability to work together closely, need to be removed. And I'm just not convinced that we're there. And the research that I do, people constantly refer to this as the means to solve the problems that's understood and recognised, and yet nothing happens on that front. And we have that same discussion going forward. So I accept it can be extremely frustrating, but I'm at 56, I'm still young enough to believe we can make a difference.
That's positive. And I mean, I think bringing up that word integration again, integration is a word, the actual complex reality of making integration happen between different agencies is another matter entirely. I want to bring in Emil on this question. And because I think from the sanctions point of view, in some ways, it's not so much a case of will government follow through? It's like, will they perhaps get a little bit overexcited having their own sanctions regime and potentially overuse it, which I know is a sort of is a point that you've raised yourself in commentaries in the past. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I feel quite spoiled now because I think the sanctions area is one where actions and words have very much both happened. The UK has thrown immense amount of resources, both in terms of kind of intellectual capacity and people into the sanctions space after leaving the EU. We have a sanctions unit in the FCDO that has a lot of people employed. I don't know the precise number. We have the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation and Treasury, which also has staffed up in recent years. And we have seen, so the Foreign Secretary said even before Brexit, we will use sanctions to target human rights abuses. During the transition period, the UK started sanctioning human rights abuses around the world. So actions is not a problem when it comes to sanctions. You're right to point out that there is perhaps a concern that sanctions can be overused. And I think that is not a problem yet for the UK, but certainly if you look at countries like the US, and particularly during the Trump administration, we did see the overuse of sanctions to the point where they were thrown at any and every problem. And I think the UK should avoid going down that same route where sanctions becomes a default response to every single problem that we face internationally. It is one tool of many. I think it's too early to say that we have an overuse problem in the UK. So far, we just have a lot of action and a lot of words on sanctions, which of course, from someone who studies sanctions is always welcomed.
Can I, Matthew, can I just come in there? Yeah,
Yeah,
I
sure.
think, if I had 5 minutes with the Foreign Secretary, I think I would remind him that when you open the sort of financial toolbox, there are other tools than merely sanctions in there. And my concern is that the foreign and the FCDO becomes the sanctions ministry, when actually there are plenty of people working away on illicit finance there already. There is this commitment in the economic crime plan to bring forward an international center of excellence on illicit finance to, basically work with countries to try and address the challenges that they face on illicit finance. So there's a bunch of tools in the box. And my concern is that he's only opened one drawer. He likes what he sees, and he's going to make the most of that without lifting his eyes to look beyond the horizon.
The danger of the man with the hammer, as it were, seeing everything as a nail. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very fair point. One of the things I want to shift focus a little bit from the kind of broader view that we've just been taking, and talk a little bit about something that Rusi's been reporting on with a recent paper on fraud as a national security issue. And it's one of our kind of leading questions here, which is there is lots and lots of disparate actions and actors involved in this particular threat. And how is the government going to come up with something new and a better way to actually deal with this? And particularly, as the question says, the bigger fish rather than the smaller fry. So I'm going to pass that over to Helena for first dibs on that one.
Yeah, no, I very much take it back to the comment I made about we need some clarity over what's the role of the intelligence and diplomatic community in tackling economic crime. And I think that's particularly pertinent with fraud and the way it's sort of manifesting, particularly over the last sort of 5 years. It is global, it's cyber enabled. A lot of the perpetrators sit in countries where we don't necessarily have good mutual illegal assistance channels. The sheer volume of it means that the criminal justice system absolutely cannot tackle the issues of response. And the victims are very disparate and not necessarily all in the UK. So that to me speaks for a much greater role for the intelligence community, particularly GCHQ, in disrupting the threat. We saw the establishment of the suspicious email reporting service last year, slightly under the radar and less publicised than I'd hoped, but it's already had some really good results in disrupting the threat. But I'd never like to let the diplomats get off the hook here. And they've rarely liked to kind of dirty their hands in the organised crime world, as Keith and I know from our time in the National Crime Agency. They are kind of dragged often kicking and screaming along to do anything on any sort of serious organised crime threat. So I think we really need to start seeing the diplomats stepping up to put pressure on governments who are hosting some of these kind of fraud factories that we see, because there's absolutely no chance of prosecuting our way out of the problem. But to finish, yes, we need diplomats, yes, we need the intelligence community, but we really actually also need to do the thing that we're not doing at all, which is the criminal justice response. You know, I don't need to speak to this audience about the woefully underfunded fraud policing response in the UK and how poorly that's structured. So I go back to that point, to the first question. You know, we're going to have a really brutal spending review, but the one thing that fraud needs is a proper UK-based fraud policing response. So I am hopeful that those fighting the fight in Whitehall can take what is in this document as an extra bit of evidence as to why we really, really need some more resources for the UK-based fraud response.
Thank you very much, Helena. I'm going to shift focus again here. Actually, and unfairly to you, Helena, this is probably a question that would come to you, but I'm going to be gentle and redirect it probably more towards Tom. And it comes from Stephen, who asks about the integrated review and the abuse and misuse of UK registered companies domestically abroad as a security threat. Tom, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that to my mind is one of the areas that, you know, we would need to see the government put its hand up and say, we recognise that we are not doing the world a service. We are providing directly from the UK or through overseas territories or crown dependencies. We're providing services that are widely abused. And I think, you know, I remember having the opportunity to visit Pakistan a couple of years ago and getting into a debate with some people there who said, look, you know, it's all very well your people turning up here and telling us that Pakistan is a problem for the UK, but do you ever actually stop and think that the UK is a problem for Pakistan because the money is headed there, it's parked there, and all the rest of it? Now, you know, there are different views, of course, on that. But my point is, I think these conversations have to start with, you know, we're all in this together. We provide the infrastructure that your kleptocrats take advantage of. Let's have a conversation about how we can collaborate to address that. On asset recovery, I mean, everybody remembers when David Cameron made his comment about the sort of fantastically corrupt countries. President Buhari of Nigeria was asked, do you want an apology? And he said, no, I want my money back. And I think, you know, we have to start approaching, to Helena's point, this is a diplomatic issue. And if we don't, then we will fail. And that kind of diplomacy, by the way, I don't think costs money. That's something you can do without needing to worry about spending reviews and all those things that Helena was referring to.
That makes perfect sense. And it's unfortunate we've got not as much time as I'd like to ask you about sort of some of the ways that we could actually integrate the diplomatic response better, but we've got quite a lot of questions, so I shall move on to a different area, and I'll let you off the hook, Helena, as Tom answered that so fully. And this is a particularly interesting one for me, from my background, interested in anti-money laundering, from Richard, which is basically making the point that we're not getting results on money laundering. So who should be held accountable? And I'm assuming that we're asking questions about whether it's the public-private sector and which parts of the public and private sector. So I'm going to ask you, Tom. It's actually a question I would have liked to have answered myself, but I won't.
Well, you can mark my answer. Look, again, as people will have heard me say before, there is that, and I can say this as an Irish passport holder, there is that Irish joke about if you ask an Irishman the way to the station, his answer is, well, I wouldn't start from here. And frankly, we wouldn't start from here. But we are where we are, and we've got to address that. And I think what we need to see, and I might tie this into a question from Gemma Rogers as well, we clearly don't have an acceptable supervisory regime in the UK. The way supervisors are operating is not yet feared by those that they are meant to supervise, from the FCA down. We know the FCA is talking about having a more data-led response to supervision and all of that. But at the moment, really, I don't think supervisors particularly make financial institutions and others quake in their boots, beyond the fact that they might not be ticking the right boxes. And of course, we know ticking boxes doesn't stop money laundering. So I think there is definitely a swathe of issues that we need to look at on the AML supervision side. That's something that we're starting to do under Helena's leadership at RUSI. Again, I think we also need to think about what is it we're trying to actually achieve? Another area that Helena looks at, when we're trying to confiscate assets, are we really going about this the right way? Discussion of a recent podcast that Helena had with Aid and Larkin. So I just think the strategy is wrong. Do we really know what we're trying to achieve here? We've got the right tools. We probably have, but I'm not sure we're using them necessarily the right way. A lot of hope was put in unexplained wealth orders, all this sort of stuff. But again, that has really not moved forward in the way people want. So I think we need to have a proper conversation about how do we use the pieces we have on the table more effectively than we do right now, because clearly we're not. But maybe Helena might want to come in on that.
Yeah, I was going to say that both Helena and I was going to ask Keith as well after that, given that they've both got background in this particular space with the NCA, and they've probably got some thoughts. So Helena, over to you.
Yeah, and I'm those who hear me speak regularly, I often say the UK's got not a problem of law, but a problem of law enforcement. So we have, as FATF recognised in their review, we have some of the most stringent laws available, in terms of asset recovery, one of my favourite topics. We've got possibly the strongest system there is. We've got so many tools at our fingertips, but there really is a problem of underfunding. And back to Richard's question about who should be held accountable. Well, I think there's been a lot of finger pointing at the private sector, and yes, there is absolutely more they can do, but I think we need to do a lot more finger pointing at the UK government's response, which is frequently focused on policy rather than practice. So yes, it's not always just put some more police on the streets, but there is a part of that. We do need a better funded law enforcement response. So to Tom's point on UWOs, there was so much hope around them. But there's a hell of low-hanging fruit in the serious organised crime space, which you could have been easily picked off with UWOs, were it to have been, but for lack of a growth of the expertise in government to do that. So I'd really like to see a massive increase in the kind of level of resources put towards particularly asset recovery efforts as part of that kind of uplift in policing numbers. I frankly don't want to see more police on the streets. I want to see more police in offices looking at spreadsheets and people's bank accounts, frankly.
You've kind of preempted one of my final questions there, Helena, about where we go next with this. But before we go to that, I'll hand over to Keith for his view.
Yes, I think, thank you. And I agree with the comments that have been made today. I think for me, it's partly the problem is this just isn't mainstreamed enough. We hide behind this, you need to be a financial investigator, and we need financial investigators, don't get me wrong. And some cases, certainly multi-jurisdictional cases, are quite complex and require some specialist skills. But that I think by doing that, it enables a number of people to think that this isn't their responsibility, that they don't have any part to play. So when police, perhaps on the street, are conducting a house search or something, they don't necessarily think to look for financial documents. They'll look for drugs and other forms of illicit goods, but won't necessarily think about some of those other issues. So I think that there's a real education process there. People respond to incentives, and when you measure the police on arrests and drug seizure, so that's what they'll recall. When you measure them on money confiscated, etc., that's what they'll concentrate on. Helen and I spoke to Sir Craig Mackay as part of his review of serious organised crime, and we made the point that if you did nothing else, why not just issue an unexplained wealth order against all the organised crime groups that exist in the UK? And his eyes lit up, actually. But I think that could cause a few problems. But I certainly think there's a need to be a little bit more audacious in how we use the tools that we have got, because we do have some very enabling and far-reaching tools.
Thank you, Keith. And we're coming towards the end, and we've touched upon here with what Helena said about more effort in asset recovery. We need more investment, as Keith was saying, in other areas. Where else do we need to see improvements in the future? We've not talked about sanctions as much as Emil probably wanted to. So I'm going to hand over to Emil and say, where would you like to see this go next on the sanctions side?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we're not talking too much about sanctions, because maybe there's not so much to talk about. There's still a lot we don't know on how the UK will use its sanctions policy. So I talked a little bit about the design of sanctions. Who will the UK target abroad? What are the objectives that will underpin UK sanctions use? What are the kind of values and the kind of threats that the UK wants to use sanctions to respond to? Perhaps where we don't know so much is on the enforcement and implementation side. The thing that takes place over in Treasury, not in the FCDO. How will the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation monitor and enforce the implementation of sanctions in the UK by UK companies, UK banks, UK financial institutions who need to adhere to these sanctions? We don't yet know exactly where the UK government's interpretation around ownership and control, for example, will fall, simply because we haven't had enough enforcement actions. We are waiting for some of these sanctions designations to maybe be challenged in court, test the system a little bit. So I would say it's not so much that we need an improvement in an area, but we need a few more years to make a judgment call on how the implementation and enforcement of sanctions is going. So that's an area that I'll be looking at. There's been a lot of thinking both prior to and during the Brexit process on how the UK would deploy its sanctions, less known about what the enforcement of those sanctions will look like. Of course, there's guidances and stuff, but we haven't yet seen the practice taking place.
Thank you, Emil. So I think we've got to 5 minutes until the end here. So I know we have lots of other questions. It's a shame that we can't go on longer and answer more of them, but thank you to those who've asked questions and so far haven't had them answered. Just to sum up on this, I had 3 I's and that came up from these discussions. One of which is implementation. That's the obvious bit. We're talking a lot about the rhetoric of this, about this particular review, and the rhetoric is good, but everybody wants to see the reality of what that actually means in practice. So, number 1, implementation. Number 2, integration. And it's called an integrated review, but what does that really mean in terms of integrated strategies and joint working between departments, both within the UK and then also working with our partners overseas? The third I, which links into that, is the international part. And yes, we focus very much on the UK space here, but we're part of a broad community. And as you quite rightly pointed out, Emil, we have most impact when we work with our partners in the sanctions area and elsewhere besides. And the final I, which you just brought up there, is interpretation, because this is a key thing about what does Whitehall actually do with this document? Where does it take it? Does it fully appreciate and internalize what it needs to do? I think that goes back to the point about implementation as well. We need to ensure that the agencies that are covered by this review, perhaps not necessarily ones that would expect to be covered by this review, fully understand and appreciate what this empowers them to do in the future. So it will be very interesting to see where they take that in the next 5 years and what we will be discussing in 2026 at the next review. So I'm going to bring this to a close now. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Tom, Emil, Helena and Keith for joining us today and provoking a really stimulating discussion. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us and providing us such insightful questions. Don't go just yet, though. If you've enjoyed this event, I think we're just going to put up the information slide here about where you can find out more about RUSI. So if you'd like to join us for further discussions on key issues on illicit finance, sanctions, economic and serious organised crime, and if you'd like to know more about our work, then please stay in touch with us with our publications and events. So follow us on Twitter at CFCS_RUSI and sign up to the CFCS mailing list that you can find via our website at rusi.org/CFCS. And for those of you willing to brave the warnings from the Director General of MI5 and continue to use LinkedIn, do follow our new Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies LinkedIn page. And finally, if you've yet to discover our podcast series, do search for the Suspicious Transaction Report wherever you get your podcasts. It's well worth a listen. And to revisit audio versions of previous events, including this one at some point in the near future, look for our catch-up podcast series, Financial Crime Insights. So thank you again for joining us today. It's been a very interesting discussion. Be interesting to see where we go next with the integrated review and what it means for illicit finance and many related topics. So thank you again, and thank you to Sabrina on the RUSI team for setting up this webinar, and have a wonderful day.